Thanks very much, and good to see you all here this lunchtime. So speaking of the podcast, I actually interviewed Clive Johnson, who was your president. I think that's the right word. I always get confused as to what the exact titles are, but at the time, so Clive's a good industry friend of mine. And I'm really happy to be here today talking about a topic that, as we'll hear, is something that's known about but is often overlooked or underplayed. And so what I'm going to try and do today is give you some insights and some light bulb moments, hopefully, to try to shift your thinking a little bit about this age-old topic. I'm really pleased to be here in September because every year in September I run a campaign which I call Sliptember. And last year, actually, we were delighted to win. Well, I say win, we came second. We were highly commended at the SHE Awards for Campaign of the Year for last year's Sliptember campaign. And it's all about raising awareness throughout the month of September. So certainly doubly delighted to be here talking to you in Sliptember. So I'm going to set the scene a bit with some context for you around the issue of slips and falls. And you might be familiar with some of these numbers, but some of them might be perhaps a bit of a surprise to you. So we've got a selection here of kind of human and financial cost figures. So not many people know this, but slipping and falling is the biggest cause of A&E attendance in the UK each year. It's the biggest cause of NHS bed days as well. Broken bones, very regular, but also we have more serious events, and we're going to talk about some of those a bit later too. Across all sectors, typically looking around a third of accidents, injuries and claims. Over £1 billion of insurance claim costs are paid out by insurers every year in the UK. The average claim is about £10,000, but there's also uninsured hidden costs, which I'm sure you guys will be familiar with. Not every pound of every incident is insurable. And in recent years, certainly since the changes to the health and safety sentencing guidelines in 2016, we've seen plenty of six-figure criminal fines from HC or local authorities for slips. So Tesco, for example, was fined almost £750,000 in 2020, just before the pandemic. And it's a big problem, yes, but it's also a long-running problem. So this chart here shows RIDDORs over the last decade, and it does bundle together slips, trips, and falls. But as you'll hear about later, slips is the vast majority of that category. And as we can see, the picture hasn't really changed in the last decade. If anything, you could argue there's been a slight uptick in recent years proportionally. But fundamentally, whatever we're doing now, is it working? Well, we obviously do have control measures. We do have policies and procedures in place. And I certainly would support the fact that without what we're doing at the moment, those figures would be even higher. But, you know, are we happy with flatlining? Are we happy that we've got hundreds of thousands of people a year getting hurt from slips and falls? Or should we be looking to go from good to great? So, you know, we're performing well at the moment. We're achieving a good standard, I guess. But we need to go from good to great. So we've got to break this status quo, and there's a very eminent and intellectual, clever person on this slide, and Albert Einstein. No, just kidding. So Einstein says, you know, that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is insanity. Well, based on the data, perhaps we're being a bit insane when it comes to slips and falls. And my firm belief, and what I hope you will get out of this session today, is stated here on the right-hand side. Death and taxes may be inevitable, but slips definitely are not. So why is this a problem then? Why are we in this position? So as I said, we are putting forward good efforts to try to prevent these accidents and deal with claims and all that stuff. But yet we're still seeing £1 billion of claims. And if you're looking at this from a risk perspective, you'd be thinking about cost of risk. Whereas a lot of the time I'm speaking to pure health and safety people, and they're thinking about incidents and riddles and things like that. If we're thinking about this from a risk assessment based approach, from a risk management approach, insurance premium costs, typical premium for business insurance, about 20% is going to be allocated to assumed slip and fall claims costs. We recently did some research with safety leaders, and what we found was that 85% of them said that slips was a relevant risk to their business, either to their staff members and or their customers. But why aren't we doing more on this area? What was cited in the research was that we're juggling priorities and that we perceive that we're doing all we can. So I'm going to try and address those issues in this talk. And so really the issue is getting a lack of attention. That's what's kind of causing that flatlining. From a mindset perspective, there are 4 common gaps, which I'm going to talk you through, and I call this the SLIP problem, SLIP being an acronym. And so all of that means really that all we're doing is kind of the basics, the superficial stuff, and that's why we're still seeing this problem drag on and on and on. But it is possible to stop slips and falls. It is possible to have a very significant impact indeed on accident figures, claims volumes, and claims costs, as these few examples will show. So even in swimming pools, even in busy places like train stations, even in environments that are constantly wet, like shower tubs and shower trays and bathtubs, sorry, it is possible to make significant improvement. Quick intro to me, having set the scene. So I am the founder of Slip Safety Services. I, every week, produce various types of safety and risk related content. So on a Wednesday morning, I host a safety roundtable where we talk about all sorts of different safety topics. I also host a safety and risk success podcast. I do a LinkedIn newsletter, very active on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn, do come and connect. My day job is all around the prevention of slip and fall accidents. In this area, I've worked in some very high profile cases, such as this one, which was a death following a slip in a Co-op store in Cornwall a few years ago. The business has won some awards. We partner with stakeholders like AXA Insurance. We've got some great blue chip clients. We do lots of kind of talking for people like you guys, IIRSM, IOSH, insurance groups, facilities management groups, and so on and so forth, all relevant stakeholders, architects. We've helped several clients, several thousand client sites to reduce risk over the last years. And at last count, we calculated we're helping clients to prevent around £10 million of claims a year. So having some good success, but still a long way to go in the context of that £1 billion bill that I mentioned before. So that's me. So let's set the scene with a bit of some problems and some misconceptions, because to me this is not necessarily a technical issue, slips and falls. It's actually starts a bit before that. It's a mindset issue, and the mindset gaps are blocking us from investing the time and effort to solve the technical problems. So what I've seen over the last 10 plus years is 4 kind of common themes, which I've pulled together into this acronym called the SLIP problem. I'm going to run you through these. So the first thing that I hear a lot, and I'm interested to hear, perhaps let me know in the chat, whether this resonates with you, whether you've ever felt this, or whether you've ever heard colleagues or other people you've come across saying similar things to these points. Is that slips are simple. What does that sound like? Just stick a sign out and it's fine, you're covered. It's okay, we've got matting, the cleaning company deals with it. oh yeah, we've got spillage control, very, very sort of straightforward, simple. This is an easy thing to do, an easy problem to solve, nothing to worry about kind of approach. Part of this is born out of the fact that we bundle together slips, trips, and falls, and slips, trips, and falls are not the same. Trips are pretty simple. So you have what's called a trip triangle, and if you can solve the trip triangle, which fundamentally is around common sense and keeping your eyes open, you can solve trip issues pretty much. Whereas slips are much more complicated, as we're going to get into. But the fact that we bundle them together means that because people perceive correctly that trips are simple, they kind of think that slips are simple as well. And actually slips, there's a lot more depth and breadth to it. And to put this into some context for you in terms of the levels of slips versus trips, and making the point again that we need to split these out because otherwise it's a problem. Here's some insurance claims data by sector showing that across all sorts of sectors, slips is by order of magnitude a much larger problem than trips. Manufacturing, 12 times as big a problem. 38% of claims slips, 3% trips. So the reality is that slips aren't simple, and the simple control measures that pretty much everybody has aren't working and aren't enough, as the data shows. So yellow signs aren't enough, spillage control isn't enough, cleaning records aren't enough. I talk about the Iceberg methodology here. So all of the stuff you can see here above the waterline is the basic stuff that pretty much everyone's doing. In spite of that, we're still having these problems. Below the water, we're going to get into some of these things today. This is where we can make the biggest impact. So what I would say is that slips are subtle, but not simple. So we can make subtle changes. We don't need to close buildings down, rip up and replace floors, undertake multi-million-pound culture change projects to solve this problem. There are subtle changes we can make, but I would sort of caution against using the word simple, because that implies that it's very, very easy. And I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's perhaps not as hard as perhaps I'm making it out to be. The next thing I've heard a lot over the years is that slips are low cost. What does that sound like? It could be, oh, it's okay, our insurance will cover it. It could be slips aren't that expensive anyway. Here's the reality with some data. AXA insurance alone spends 80 million a year on slip claims in the UK, 80. To put that into some context, manual handling is their next largest cause, which is 30 million. So slips is more than twice as big a problem as manual handling. We've talked about some of the human costs, the criminal fine costs, and the hidden costs. And we've mentioned that insurance premium is likely to be driven by potential slip and fall claims as well. So slips are definitely not low cost. Slips are impossible to prevent. This is one that we hear a lot. What does that sound like? Whatever you do, you're bound to get slip accidents. If that floor's wet, it's bound to be slippery. There's nothing I could do to have prevented that accident. Those kinds of expressions, I'm sure you've heard something like that before from people in the past. As I shared with you earlier, the reality is you definitely can make a massive reduction in these incidents, so they're not impossible to prevent. And the last thing that we hear a lot is that slips are paltry, and I had to go through thesaurus.com to come up with a letter that began with a word that began with the letter P, but paltry basically means insignificant or not too serious. So that could sound like loads of people slip over, but very few get seriously hurt. Here are some examples just coming up now where that is far from the case, and if any of these people's family heard somebody say that slips were paltry, they'd probably be pretty upset. We've got Stanley May slipping, banging his head and dying when he was doing his grocery shopping. Irina slipping in a shower, passing away. Malcolm, who suffered an amputation. Eugenie Bouchard, who's a tennis player who had a concussion after slipping at the US Open. So constantly we are seeing big, severe, serious issues as a result of slips. And yes, these are the minority, of course, of slips. But because there are so many slips, there are a big number of these more serious incidents as well. I'll share with you a quick personal story to illustrate this point as well. So one of my best friends who I've known for 20 years, went to university together, she was pregnant with her second child, and she was in the playground with her son, her first child. She was about 7 or 8 months pregnant. She slipped on a surface that should never have been there. It was a smooth surface in an outside area that was going to get wet because it's outside. She shattered her ankle, and she and her husband had a horrendous next few months. She had to go in a wheelchair. She couldn't have her ankle looked at before the birth of her daughter. So her daughter was born. She had a quick cuddle, then she was knocked out and had her ankle reset. So not only was she dealing with childbirth and recovery and having a new baby, but also having to try to heal up from very severe injury. And even now, 4 years later, she still has swelling, she still has aches and pains, she still suffers a lot from that injury. So slips definitely are not paltry. So I've set the scene there with a bit of an apocalyptic view. Apologies about that. So Rome is falling, or whatever the expression is. Sounds like that could be quite a difficult situation to deal with it. But the good news is that there are ways for us to overcome these challenges. So let's go into this, which is the more positive side of today's talk. So the reality is that the slip problem is a myth. The truth is that slips are serious, they're scientific, and they are absolutely stoppable. So 3 big things to bear in mind, make a mental note of, jot down, keep imprinted in your mind that slips are serious, they're scientific, and they're stoppable. And the way that we approach this problem is by taking a scientific approach, which we've coined as Slipology. And there's a 4-step process that we go through with our clients, which is assessing, so trying to quantify using the science to understand really where the problems are, lots of depth to doing that, then improving the situation, maintaining it and evidencing it. And this is all around trying to stop things from happening in the first place, but also be in a position to defend any claims that might happen and to drive down your total cost of risk through basically having the certainty that this risk is under control. And I'm going to give you today 4 actions that you can take, 4 things to think about, and they all start with the letter T. So the first one is to tune your chimes, and chimes is an acronym. I'm a fan of acronyms, as you can probably tell. And these are the 6 reasons why somebody might slip. So these are kind of the key principles that you should remember. And when you're doing a slip risk assessment, it's these 6 areas you should be looking at. And I say clearly a slip risk assessment, not a slip and trip risk assessment, because as we've already seen, slips is a bigger problem and much more detailed and should be dealt with on its own. So let's run through what this means then. So C is for contamination. Now, any floor that is properly clean and fully dry is unlikely to present a slip risk. But any level of contamination, and that could be liquid like water or oil, it could be something solid like dust, it could be a semi-solid like a grape or a piece of fruit or a chip or something like that. Any kind of contamination is going to produce a barrier between the foot and the floor, and therefore will affect the chances of somebody slipping. And if we learnt one thing from COVID, and I'm sure we learnt a lot, it's that not all contamination is visible. So you've got to remember that just because a floor might look clean, there could be contamination there that you just can't perceive or you can't see. Just as you can't see COVID on a surface, we have to be cleaning and disinfecting like our lives depend on it, because they do. And the same goes with floors and slip safety. So if we can manage contamination, if we can prevent contamination from building up, if we can understand quantifiably how much contamination we can withstand before risk becomes too much, then we're in a better place to reduce the risk of accidents, injuries and claims. H is for heel, so this is all about footwear. In order for somebody to slip, there needs to be a foot involved, just as there needs to be a floor involved. Now, not all shoes are created equal, is one point. So if you provide safety footwear to your staff, is it slip resistant footwear? Because just because something is a safety shoe doesn't necessarily mean that it's got good slip resistance. Just because a sole has a texture doesn't mean that it has good grip. And you can't tell just by looking at it. So one question is, if we're in a position to be controlling footwear, then are we specifying the correct type of footwear for the right use? And you'll need a different type of safety shoe with slip resistance around a swimming pool as you do in a kitchen, as you do walking on grass outside, for example. The other side to this is, of course, customers or people where we're not providing safety footwear. And in that case, we can't really control what people are wearing on their feet. So what we need to do instead is understand what they're likely to be wearing and ensure that the rest of our risk assessment and our control measures is based on a kind of worst case scenario for footwear. So to say, of course, that lady slipped, she was wearing high heels in a restaurant, misses the point. If you're operating a restaurant, people are going to be wearing high heels. You should be thinking about somebody wearing high heels and making it as safe as reasonably practicable for somebody that is wearing high heels. Next is I, which is individual. These are all the human factors. So there are some physical elements to this, and there are some psychological elements to this. So age and sex have a role in the likelihood of slipping. If you're an 80-year-old woman, you're more likely to slip and fall than a 20-year-old man. You're also, of course, more likely to seriously hurt yourself because older people have more brittle bones, etc., and recovery times are going to take longer. If we are walking in a straight line at a normal speed on a flat surface, we require a certain level of balance and grip. If, however, we are doing stuff that isn't walking at a normal speed in a straight line, for example, twisting, turning, pushing, pulling, carrying, rushing, then we're more likely to slip. So to what extent can we manage the activities that people are undertaking to try to reduce the need for that kind of activity, which is going to make a slip more likely. Here we've also got things like mindset, signage. What I'd say on signage is I mentioned the co-op slip, which resulted in a death and a civil claim and a criminal fine. There's absolutely no question at all that yellow signs were in situ when that incident happened. They didn't stop the slip, they didn't stop the death, they didn't stop the civil claim, they didn't stop the criminal fine. So signage alone is not an adequate control. And then this also covers things like training, mindset among staff, etc. M is for maintenance. So this splits neatly into three. We've got wear and tear, change of use, and cleaning. Wear and tear, obviously floors can change over time and their slip resistant characteristics will change too. You've got to be aware of that. Change of use is where we might modify or jig around parts of buildings or even take over new buildings, and we need to think about if we've changed the use of an area, Is it now a foreseeably wet or contaminated area when before it wasn't, for example? And then cleaning is really, really critical. We all clean our floors every day, or most floors get cleaned every day. We all regularly clean our floors in a commercial setting, but are we cleaning for aesthetic or are we cleaning for safety? Most even professional cleaning companies don't know how to clean for safety. They're cleaning for aesthetics, and so they could be doing things to floors that they believe are correct, but actually are making them more slippery, not less. E is for environment, so this includes things like the weather and condensation, but also the built environment. So if we've got noise, if we've got low lighting or very harsh lighting, we might be more likely to slip. If we've got steps, stairs, ramps and slopes, that will heighten the risk of someone slipping. And a big one here is entrance matting. So what we often see is people have entrance matting and therefore they perceive that their reception floor is a dry environment. In reality, most buildings have wholly insufficient entrance matting in terms of its depth. And the test here is to stand inside on a wet day and see if the floor beyond the matting is getting wet. If it is, then actually you've got a wet area, not a dry area. And finally is surface. So this is about the floor. So to what extent is the floor slip resistant? If you think about walking down the pavement on your high street, you're probably going to be walking down a quite textured paving slab type of floor. That's going to be safe to walk upon even when it's wet, as long as it's looked after pretty well. Whereas if you stepped off of that high street into the lobby of a 5-star hotel, you're probably walking on a shiny marble or some kind of high-end stone surface that has a reflection and looks beautiful, but is very, very slippery. So clearly we do all understand that certain floors are more slippery than others, but yet what we don't do is quantify how safe our floors are. We assume based on looking at a floor that it must be safe, or we assume based on the fact that we've got a certificate from when the floor was installed 10 years ago that the floor was safe, but is it still safe? So that's the CHIMES model, and that's kind of a way of approaching a risk assessment for slips. Key questions: which are controllable and when? And if you can't control certain aspects of this, then put more emphasis on the rest. This is an average performance for CHIMES across several hundred different buildings in different sectors. And what you can see is that typically people are doing quite well on HEAL. They're doing all right on maintenance, environment, but they often have room for improvement in individual and surface. How am I getting this data, you're asking? I'm going to come on to that in a minute, but there's a way for you to score your current performance and see where you are and therefore where you need to improve. So if you fitted this average and this was the position you were in, then my advice to you would be, right, we need to focus on surface and we need to focus on individual and try and get those up towards the rest of these areas. And then and only then should we be thinking about what we can do on the other areas to further improve in a holistic way. The second T I'm going to talk to you about is treating floors zonally. So the vast majority of floors are not likely to get wet or contaminated. And yet what we see when we look at slip, trip and fall policies is that we take broad brush approach to all areas and we just say we're going to do this, this and this. Actually, what we need to do is drill down and be more focused on the 5% of floors where they are going to get wet or contaminated, and we need to be putting more time and more effort into those areas because that's where the risk is. For the 95% of floors, we just need to focus on spillage control, because if we can keep them clean and dry, they won't be a slip risk, and to some degree as well, cleaning. So we don't want to be leaving residues on the floors or polishing them such that they become slippery in their own right. So whatever sector you're in, you're only going to have a certain proportion of floors that are going to get wet or contaminated. Of course, in certain sectors, it's going to be more than 5%, and in other sectors it's going to be less than 5%. I get that, but as a broad rule, the vast majority of flaws we don't need to worry about. We need to be spending our time on the small minority, those kinds of areas. The next T is test your flaws. And I mentioned that we often assume that a flaw is safe by looking at it. There is a science to quantifying how safe a flaw is when it's dry and when it's wet. And it's this contraption here, which is a graphic of it. And I'm going to show you a video of the real thing in a minute. And it's called a pendulum test. So this is what the HSE use. It's what's used in courts by lawyers and expert witnesses. That's one of the things that I do when I'm not doing webinars, do some expert witness work. What it does, as you'll see, is it mimics the heel striking the floor. It gives you a number called a pendulum test value, and it can be used on any floor in situ, so you can actually test in the real world what's going on. It's not a out-of-the-box theoretical factory value. This is a real test, a real number from your actual floor. So here's a video of the pendulum test being used. And what this guy is going to do is he's going to spray the floor with water. He would have tested the floor dry first, but he's going to spray the floor with water. He's going to release a foot, and the foot swings down. And as you'll see, it swings through like a pendulum, hence being called a pendulum test. As the foot swings down, it strikes the floor and it mimics the heel strike. If you think about when you're walking, you're planting your heel at an angle with a fair bit of weight on it. What you're not doing, which some people do when they're sort of thinking, is the floor slippery, is shuffling their feet around. That's not how you walk. And then as it swings through, it pushes a pointer onto a gauge on the left-hand side of the frame of the machine. So you can see that there are some numbers there. You can't see, you won't be able to read the numbers, but I'll tell you what those numbers are in a minute. But this is the pendulum test in action. So spray the floor, release the foot, swings through, pushes onto the gauge. I'll show you it a second time. So hopefully you can see how that is mimicking somebody actually walking on a floor, and why this is the method that the HSE use. So if you did ever end up with a HSE inspection after a slip, they'd send somebody in from the HSL in Buxton and they would do this test. The output of the test, as I said, is a number called a pendulum test value, and the number is a way of categorizing your risk. So there are 3 categories. If you have a score of 24 or less, then you have a high slip potential. If you have a score of between 25 and 35, you have a moderate slip potential. And if you have a score of 36 or above, you have a low slip potential. And in the middle of this chart, you'll see some data that HSE came up with in partnership with some other organizations a few years ago. And this shows you the accident risk exposure. So why do they say that 36 is a low slip potential? Because that gives you a 1 in a million risk exposure. Whereas if you've got a score, a PTV score of 24, you've got a 1 in 20 risk exposure. So if you are anything like me, then I think you'd rather be up on the right-hand side of the gauge than the left. But the point is that without the testing, you just simply can't know. Even me, who does this for a living and has been doing this for over 10 years, I cannot look at, if you gave me photographs of 100 floors and asked me to guess the slip potential when wet of those floors, I would probably get more right than a layperson would, but I wouldn't get them all right because it's impossible to know just by looking. The only way of knowing is by doing the test. And so that is the key benefit, I suppose. The first benefit of doing this testing is to know where you stand on this scale. And then if you are towards the left and not the right, then you can take some steps to reduce that risk. The second reason to get the test is that it will help you to defend insurance claims. So David Scott here on the screen is a lawyer who works for Keogh's, and he helps to defend insurance claims for leisure and hospitality clients. I interviewed him on my podcast, and we were talking specifically about somebody slipping around a swimming pool. And he said that somebody might slip around a pool, the floor was wet, they legitimately hurt themselves, and therefore they feel they're entitled to make a claim. His response to that was no. Just because the floor is wet, just because somebody slipped, just because they legitimately hurt themselves, that doesn't mean that you are liable to pay them out for a claim, because if you've got this testing data, as well as other things, of course, but if you've got this data, you should expect to defend that claim, because your responsibility is not to prevent all accidents, it's to take reasonable and practicable steps to reduce risk. And actually having this data is going above and beyond that, because most people don't have it. So if you have got that data and you've got the certificate that's valid and it's in date, and you'd want that to be within 12 months for it to be considered current, then you are in a very, very strong position to defend a claim, even if somebody does legitimately hurt themselves. And the fourth T is to take the slip prevention scorecard. So I was able to show you the average score of businesses on Chimes because of this tool which we've developed, which is a self-assessment diagnostic tool. It's free. It takes about 3.5 minutes. And you answer a series of questions, and it will give you a score for each of the chimes, as well as an overall score. So by using this, you can sort of map out where you currently are now and get a baseline, a benchmark for your current performance. It'll highlight where you're doing well, and it'll show you where you've got room for improvement. And the URL is scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk. This is the kind of insight you get initially, which is the scores for the categories. So if you were this person here, then you're scoring well on 2 categories, you're scoring okay on environment, and you've got room for improvement on heel, individual, and surface. So the main benefit of this is actually taking a holistic approach, getting that line in the sand of where you are now, and then actually showing you where you need to focus your efforts to drive down the risk from impacting you going forward. So that's the 4 T's, 4 things you can do to address this. Just quickly, you might be interested to know why do I care about this? And it's not about trying to stop £1 billion of claims. It's actually due to something that happened to me about 10 years ago. So cast your mind back to 2012, the summer of the London Olympics. My wife, she was my girlfriend at the time, but now my wife and I lived in London then, as we do now, and we decided on this Sunday to go for a trip to this place called Columbia Road Flower Market. We had a nice lunch and bought some flowers. On the way back, we drove and called into Sainsbury's in Islington, and we parked up our car and we went towards the store. And this store is a bit weird because there's no direct entrance to the car park. You have to walk around and along the road and around this corner in the photograph to get into the store. And I was standing probably about 5 or 10 yards behind where this guy in the blue jumper is standing now, when, or say standing, I was walking down the road, when a car sped around that corner, lost control, mounted the curb, and drove into me or ran me over. So this was me later that afternoon, looking a bit shell-shocked and worse for wear. And I, as you can see there, broke my collarbone, I broke my wrist, I broke my ankle, so that my whole left-hand side was impacted. Cuts, bruises, scrapes, neck damage, etc. So it wasn't a slip, but I have suffered a serious accident that wasn't my fault and that was unexpected. And since that day, I've been, very much passionate about trying to help other people to avoid that from happening to them. And if you look at the data, as I shared with you at the outset, slips is the biggest cause of this happening. So to me, it makes sense to start there. And my big goal that I'm working towards is to try to have an impact of 500,000 people around the year, fewer people around the world, a year having to suffer a slip and a fall. So the reason I do the podcast and the content and the talks like this is to raise awareness, because I can't physically stop 500,000 people myself, but if I can just get people to think about this problem, give it a second look, I suppose, think a bit more deeply, give them some frameworks, give them some practical help if I can, then we're on our way to that goal. Just starting to draw this to a close, what are the benefits for you? So that's why I'm interested in this. That's why my passion lies here. What are the benefits to you to taking this scientific approach towards slip safety? Well, there are some immediate benefits. So you'll have the ability to take proactive, quick scientific steps to reduce the risk. So you'll be able to know that you've reduced the risk in your buildings straight away, because these practical, quantifiable things are very clear as day as to what's been done and what hasn't been done and what effect that's had on the risk. But obviously in the long term, there's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot richer benefits. So, of course, less harm. From your perspective as a risk and safety professional, more time and more ability to focus and more ability to prioritize, because you're not having to deal with so many accident forms and claims and instant investigations from slips and falls, and of course lower costs. So we've worked with clients where, as a result of taking a proactive approach and a scientific approach, they've been able to see a £65,000 reduction in their insurance premium, for example, as well as obviously saving money on claims. We worked with one client in the leisure space, and they managed to reduce their claims from 1 per week, slip claims, this is 1 per week, to 1 per month. So that's a reduction of sort of 80% and a saving of several £100,000 of claims costs a year. So if that's resonated with you, I would certainly suggest hopping on and using the scorecard, and then we could book in a time to chat through your results, your report, and see what next steps might be sensible for you to take. There's no cost to any of that stuff. Very happy to help. And if there's anything you think you can do to support Sliptember, I'd love to chat with you about that. If you've got any networks or you write a blog or something like that, or if you've got a podcast or whatever it might be, really be happy to jump on and try and support and help to raise awareness about this big problem. So wrapping up then, I suppose what I'd say is, if you thought this was about slip testing and anti-slip and footwear and things like that, you've missed the point, or perhaps I've not explained it very well. For me and my business, what we're all about is, and what we're known for, is trying to bring a fresh scientific approach to an age-old problem and to really making an impact in this problem that needs to be addressed and is stale and stagnant and needs a shake-up. And the idea of everything that we do, and hopefully you've got this from this presentation today, is to leave our clients or our audience or our partners, whoever it is, feeling more confident about this topic because they know more, and having certainty that their risks are under control. So thank you very much for your attention. Here's a few next steps for you. Take the scorecard. There's the interview with Clive I mentioned. And if you're on LinkedIn, do connect. If you search for Christian Harris Slip, you'll almost certainly find me. And I'm very happy to take some questions. And I think I am, bang on time. So how's that for you?
That's perfect, Christian. Thank you for an excellent presentation.
It's almost like I've done it before.
No, that was a really interesting presentation, and I think the passion always comes through when there's a personal experience there when that is drives what it is you're trying to achieve. So thank you for that. We've got 3 questions so far. So if anyone wants to ask any more questions, please feel free. So the first one is, of all the slips which occur per autumn in the UK, are they heavily weighted towards winter, cold, ice, snow, or is it fairly even?
So we do have accidents year round, because obviously if you think of sectors like leisure, hospitality and leisure, or manufacturing, those are typically inside in environments that are constantly getting wet or contaminated, not necessarily through the weather. But yes, there is a spike. And one of the reasons I do Sliptember in September is because we're coming up to that point where the weather is starting to turn. And so there is a spike. Chris Whitty spoke about this, I remember, in one of the COVID press conferences about pressures on the NHS during the winter. So there is a spike in winter months, and that is a combination of things that are happening outside, in whether it be snow or ice, but also the fact that, as I said earlier, we often have ineffective or insufficient entrance systems in our buildings, and so that contamination is being brought inside, and slips are happening within a building, but caused in part by the environment outside.
Thank you. The next question is, Christian, thanks very much for that. We are involved in the design side of new builds. Is there a way of finding out the PTV of new materials, as most seem to come with R ratings?
R ratings. Yeah, no, absolutely. So we do that. So we work with a number of architects, a number of floor suppliers, a number of contractors. So compared to 10 years ago, when I first got involved in this industry, there are more and more floor suppliers that are providing PTV scores for their materials, but it still isn't, as you say, anywhere near 100%. So if you've got materials that you'd like to get tested because you want to specify them and you want to specify the right material for the right location, then that's something that we can help with. So we provide slip testing as a service, for example. That's typically when we the journey that we typically go through with a client might be starting with a webinar like this and them getting a bit of knowledge and inspiration, then perhaps them doing the scorecard, then having a chat and seeing if there's anything we can help with, and if there is, then normally we'd go into doing a slip test and then kind of on from there. But yeah, we absolutely help with slip testing for any materials and any specifications as well.
Great, and thanks for that, Ben. If you want to contact me, I know you've got my contact details. I'll happily pass on Christian's contact details. The next one is, great presentation, Christian. The fact that the slips, trips and falls are grouped together is unfortunate, as this may not highlight the area of slips as it should do. Do you have advice on separating these as they should be?
I'm with you. Funny enough, yesterday I mentioned I do a safety roundtable every Wednesday, and yesterday's was called "Slips, Trips and Falls, Stop This Folly," whereby the point I was making was we've got to stop bundling these things together. The challenge, I think, is that everybody bundles them together, so changing is difficult. So even HSE, on their website would talk about slips, trips and falls, slips, trips and falls. Now, of course, they do then go into the fact that a slip is very different to a trip, but still it's kind of widely done. Insurance companies do it and so on. So, I mean, one of the things we were talking about yesterday was just trying to look at this from an incident capture, data capture perspective. So if you could try to introduce something where, as and when there's an incident, you're just capturing that bit of extra detail to try to break out whether it's a slip or a trip, then that would help you to better understand what's actually going on, A, B, help you to then put the control measures in place that are appropriate, because going in and paying money to send my team in to do a slip test would be an absolute waste of time if people are tripping, for example. So I think that's realistically what is achievable at a sort of business level. I think the bigger conversation around trying to declutter, decategorize, degroup them is a longer term thing that I am going to be pushing, but we'll have to see how much progress we can make on that.
Great, thank you. We've got another couple of questions. Are there any sectors or settings where the chimes model wouldn't apply?
Good question. So I would always use it as a starting point, even if it was to then disqualify it, if that makes sense. But I could say, you know, if you worked for Ocado or Amazon, for example, and you were responsible for warehouse staff, then chimes would absolutely apply. If you were responsible for delivery drivers, would it apply? It still would apply, but what you'd find is that you would look at some of these things and basically disqualify them because you couldn't control them. So then you'd still be able to control a number of things. So I think that pretty much I can't think of another scenario where it wouldn't apply at all. So I think it's it's the way to start approaching this. And then I think what I said earlier is, if you've got these 6 areas, if you can only control 4 out of 6 for whatever reason, well, you need to do a good job on those 4. If you can control all 6, then that gives you more options, and we should be trying to create a sort of high level of a holistic equilibrium across the 6. But if we can only control 2, 3 or 4, then we want to be really striving for excellence in those 2, 3 or 4, because otherwise we're likely to struggle.
Thank you for that. So the next one is, can you speak a bit more about footwear? What specific standards are there and what should we be looking for?
Yep, a good question. So there are European standards for footwear, and I would characterize those as a bit like an 11+ exam, maybe, whereas what you're looking for is a PhD. So you might have SR, A, B, or C ratings for footwear, but that doesn't necessarily tell you that much. The HSE developed a few years ago a system of rating footwear called GRIP, GRIP, which they do, and you can find more information about that on the HSE website. But the GRIP rating is a much more robust way of assessing the slip-resistant characteristics of footwear. It's similar to the Pendulum Test, is what we use here in the UK. In Europe, they don't use the Pendulum Test. They use, as somebody said, R ratings, which is a totally different way of testing. And according to the view of the HSE, it's a far less robust way. It's a far less precise way of testing, and that's because the European standards for lots of safety things are driven not really by the government as they are here with an independent body, HSE, but they're driven in large part by industry groups and sort of influencer bodies. And so you have footwear manufacturers influencing a less stringent type of footwear testing, and you have floor manufacturers influencing a less stringent type of floor slip resistance testing. So we're lucky, that we've got the HSE who are kind of leading the way and upholding the highest standards here.
Great, thank you for that. It was a very comprehensive answer. Now, this is a long question, so hopefully I do it justice in asking it. Thanks for your insightful presentation. I work for Dubai Metro and Tram as a health and safety advisor, and the number of slips, trips and falls is rising now that we are approaching the holiday season. What would you advise, as we will receive visitors/riders from different countries?
So I would suggest you do the scorecard. So pick a station and go and have that in your mind and do the scorecard there, or pick a train, carriage, or wherever actually the incident's happening. And that will give you a bit of a starting point of how well you're doing at a high level in terms of control measures. We do quite a lot of work in sort of rail environments. So we work with Network Rail, for example, and some of the train operating companies. And one of the challenges is, of course, from a human factors perspective, that people are pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, rushing, carrying. And so you need to bear that in mind and think about maybe things that you can do to try to address that where possible. Here's an example from Euston Station in London, where the concourse is at a high level, if you've ever been there, and the platforms are at a lower level and they have ramps going down. There was one particular ramp where lots of incidents were happening and where people were rushing. And so we advised them to put in some, to improve the surface of the floor to make it less slippery when it was wet, but B, to put in some kind of barriers at the bottom to slow people down so that they weren't, they couldn't rush all the way down and round the corner and so on. And that did have a good effect. So there's lots that could be done. Connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to hop on a Zoom and go through some specifics and learn a bit more. But it's hard to go into too much detail when without knowing the full detail. But yeah, I'd start with looking at chimes, doing the scorecard. That'll give you a starting point, and then happy to do a bit more of a deep dive with you. My father-in-law lives in Dubai, so I've got a vested interest, because if he ever uses the system, I want him to be safe.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I had a coughing fit there. I wasn't sure my voice was going to come out. So we come to the last question for today. What are the most common mistakes that businesses make in this area? That's an interesting one.
I think I'd sort of go back to the slip problem, really. I think it's a mindset issue. So the most common mistakes are that they're not doing enough, or they're doing things superficially, or and that's because there's this mindset issue. So I think it's all about, for me, trying to and why I do talks like this is just to try to get people to think a bit differently, to have a second look at this, and just to appreciate that actually there's a bit more to it than perhaps you might think. And therefore, if once you've kind of got to that point, if you believe that slips are scientific, if you believe that slips are stoppable, if you believe that they're serious, then you'll want to do a bit more than most people do, and therefore you'll make an improvement. If you sort of believe that slips are not very serious, not that important, not that interesting, can't do anything about it, then you're never going to change. So it's kind of a mindset thing, I would say, is the key difference maker.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for today. I really enjoyed your presentation, as I'm sure everyone else did, judging by the comments. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy week to present to the South East branch members today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and just to remind you, the recording will be uploaded onto YouTube. I'll try and do it today, but if not, it will be early next week, and your attendance certificates will come out with the email, which comes out this time tomorrow. So have a great afternoon or evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks.